Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we are joined by an author of the hottest selling book on God in Europe, and he's crossed the pond digitally today to tell us about it. Thanks for joining the show. I see he's holding it up right now. Everybody, if you see it, I hope you buy it. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about the book, and then we'll start diving into the content.
Yes, thank you very much, Jake. I'm a French, as you will notice at my French accent, and I'm 59, and I have 6 children. And I was not a believer when I was 20. I believed that believers were irrational people, and I was studying science in a polytechnic school, and a very good school in France, but. In my opinion, in the world in which I lived, the question of God was not there. And But suddenly, when I have to find my way in this life, to find my happiness and to find my job and many things like this, I think that I had to have a global worldview, and in this worldview, the question of God is very important. And I was saying, if there because if there is no God at all, everything will disappear. We are there for a very short time, and after this there is nothing. So it's a very dark vision of the world. And in the opposite, if God exists, there is something outside time, space, and matter, something eternal, something that will remain forever. And if we can interact with this, it changes everything. So it's absolutely two different ways of viewing the world. And my question was: is it possible to make a choice, a rational choice between the two? And my surprise at the age of 20 was that it exists a lot of very rational, independent, convergent reasons to believe in God. And it changed my life because I became a Catholic. And after this, all my life was changed. And after a while, I published a video about the reasons to believe that converted me. And a friend of mine, Michel-Yves Bolloré, contacted me and said, "Oh, it's very good, but we can do better. We can do a book in order to make a point on this for the general public, not only for the specialists, but for everybody." So this book is about science. This book is very thick, but it's written for ordinary people like me, like you, in order to understand. Because at the end, we'll repeat this a lot. At the end, all this is very simple. So the question of God, as we said, is one of the most important questions of our lives. And we can make a decision because, as Newton said in the past, he said he was on the shoulders of the giants that came before. The giants were the scholars, the philosophers, but now the scientists that made a lot of discoveries, and we can use these discoveries in order to make a decision because they have a lot of implications. So if we are looking in the field of science, because this book is not only about science, it's about philosophy, morality, history, the great enigmas of the humanity history, and also about science, of course. So if we are speaking of science, there is 4 different, very important conclusions of the global science. The first one, the summary in our book, is this graph. This graph is saying that for 4 centuries, from Copernicus to Freud, via Galileo, Laplace, Darwin, Newton, science seems to be able to explain the world without the hypothesis of God. And at the end of this, Marx and Freud, who claimed to be scientists, they said that the religion was toxic. It was the opium of the people. So because of all this, a very strong materialist and scientific current dominated intellectually in the past, in the last centuries. And we could imagine that it will continue like this forever, that you will have science answering all the questions without the hypothesis of God. But it's not at all what happened. We have a great reversal. That great reversal, we can summarize it in 4 points. The first one, the discoveries are the thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, relativity, the expansion of the universe, the discovery of the Big Bang, the discovery of complexity in biology, but also the discoveries of all the fine-tunings of the universe. So all this converge into 4 points. The first one is, as Einstein demonstrated, we are in what we call a space-time, in which time, space, and matter are inextricably linked. In fact, it's very curious, but you cannot imagine one without the two others. And this world, in this universe, is very special. If you go in a black hole, for example, time will go very slowly. And before you enter the black hole, if you turn back and look at the universe, you will see the time accelerating till the end of the times before you go to the black hole. If you are on a light photon, you will have the time will not. It's for you, not for you, but for the people who look to you. The time will continue, will stay the same. So it's a very special world. We call it a space-time, and Einstein had an intuition. This intuition, he creates a theory. This theory makes mathematical models, and the models make previsions, and previsions were verified very quickly. So now everybody agrees we are in a space-time. Second, there is many reasons to believe that this space-time had a beginning. Not only the Big Bang, but thermodynamics, physics, mathematics, rationality, the impossibility of cyclic universes. A lot of different sciences, different fields of knowledge converge to say that there is a beginning. And third, there is what we call a fine-tuning of every parameter of the universe. For example, the fine-tuning of the initial data of the universe, of the forces, not only the value, but also the ratio of the different forces of the universe, and all the laws of quantum mechanics, physics, chemistry, and biology. All this is absolutely calibrated and adjusted incredibly. So with these three conclusions, you can make a very simple deduction, because how can you explain if there is a beginning of time, space, and matter emerging together? It's very important. It's not only the beginning of time and matter, it's also the beginning of space. And the most important is the beginning of space. What we call space, what you have around you now, was created before, if we can say before, there was no space. As soon as you have space, you have time and matter, because you have quantum fields, you have particles appearing and disappearing. So the creation of time, space, and matter is the creation of space. So the cause at the origin of this is outside space, outside time, outside matter. It's transcendent. It has the power to create everything that exists. And it also created and adjusted everything so that atoms could be stable with very precise value, that stars could burn 10 billion years, like the sun, for example, which is absolutely improbable. You need a very special ratio between the electromagnetic force and the gravity force, 10 to the power of 39. And complex life could exist, which is also absolutely improbable. So, to conclude, the natural conclusion of this emergence of time, space, and matter and the fine-tuning is an intelligence with a lot of power creating all this. It's really the natural conclusion. And the last but not least point number 4, is that all alternative theories that try to explain the world without God have so far failed or are very difficult to sustain. For example, if you imagine the multiverse, the theory of everything, the cyclic universes, the universe created from nothing. We have a chapter with a lot of different hypotheses like this. In fact, it does not work. If we can go deeper if you want in the details, but it does not work. So at the end, we had meetings in Princeton, in Berkeley, in Cambridge, in Oxford, with top scientists, with Nobel Prize winners, with cosmologists of Princeton, the senior scientist of the Hubble Webb Telescope or the James Webb Telescope, people like this. And we explain our view of the world. We explain to them exactly what I just tell you. And I said, for example, with a Nobel Prize winner of Saul Perlmutter or a lot of like this, I said, what do you think of our vision? And they said, of course, God is an hypothesis, but we as scientists cannot say this, because if we say God, we stop working. And we need to try to find a natural explanation. But of course, today, I admit, we have nothing. And I was joking.
Wow.
I say, it's not only today that we have nothing. It will be forever nothing, because if there is a beginning of time, space, and matter, the cause at the origin of this will forever, not only now, forever, the cause will be outside. It cannot be different.
Well, let me
So
read a few
that's
quotes if you like
that's
to kind of
the vision of
reinforce
science
that
for
if you
me.
like. I found some incredible
Excuse
quotes
me?
that you have in your book here about one is a Nobel Prize. He shared the Nobel Prize. British physicist George Thomson, who says probably every physicist would believe in a creation if the Bible had not, unfortunately, said something about it many years ago and made it seem old-fashioned. You quote
Yes,
another physicist, Robert
yes,
Wilson, who is the co-laureate, who said, certainly, if you are religious, I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match with Genesis. And that speaks of the Big Bang. And then you have another one, another co-laureate in physics, Arnaud Panazzi. The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. So you say the admission of we have nothing, that's a big deal. But those admissions saying, listen, if we had started with, I mean, this is absolute confirmation of what we see in Scripture, and I think we've lost that, or at least when I was growing up, this is the story I heard. The Big Bang is a secular theory, and it competes with and it replaces the need for God. And I actually heard this first when I was in
not at all.
3rd grade. And they told me this. It was a Christian school, and they were a creationist. And they described the Big Bang and said, "This is ridiculous." And I raised my hand and I said, "This is exactly what I thought we saw in Genesis, that everything came out of nothing." And I was assured, no, the Big Bang was a secular theory. But I like that you look historically about the evolution of our ideas about the origin of the universe, and you show that it's absolutely to the contrary. In fact, you bring
Yes,
in some of the,
you
what I
know, we
really
have,
liked is the section with the Soviets.
yes, the Soviets. Yes, I was just wanted to tell you about these 2 chapters. The chapter, a very interesting chapter, is the number
Sure.
13, with 100 different top scientists speaking of God, miracles, incredible coincidences, and most of them are not believers, but when they are making science today, they are concluding that they need to speak about God. They cannot do otherwise. First, and the second one, as you said, is a very original chapter about what happened in Russia, in Germany, and in China. This chapter, all these people were persecuted not because they were making politics, but they were they were just making science. And the conclusion of physics was that there is a beginning. They were disciples of Alexander Friedman, the first one who concluded that Einstein equations were not stable, and the universe should be in expansion or contraction. And he said, because of this, there is a moment in where the universe began like a point, and it was not acceptable for the communist atheist regime of Russia, because communist people were clever and they said that if there is a beginning, there is a God. So as they said that there is no God, there is no beginning. And if science concludes as a beginning, exactly as you said, it's like the Bible. And so the people in Russia, not only in Russia, also in Germany, also in China, but also in the West, for example, I had a very interesting talk with John Lennox from Oxford. He said that he remembered that when he was young, when in the 1960s, when the people discovered that there is a beginning, all the atheist scientists say we have a problem. We cannot accept this because if there is a beginning, there is a God. So it's before the Big Bang, the thermodynamics conclude that there is a beginning, because thermodynamics explain that the universe, all the stars will cease to exist in one moment, what we call the thermal death of the universe. The sun and every stars are burning hydrogen, transforming into helium, and but it's a tank of hydrogen, and in one moment, in more than 4 billion years, there will be no hydrogen in the sun, so the sun will cease to exist, and all the stars will do the same. So when people like Carnot, Boltzmann, Clausius, and Kelvin in the 19th century discovered the laws of thermodynamics, they ask themselves, how is it possible that stars are still burning? Because if you have, we have this image in the book. You see, if you look at a fireplace like this, if you have logs burning in the fireplace, you are sure that in a few hours, logs will be ashes, will become ashes, and you have there is a direction. You never have ashes becoming logs. It's always logs becoming ashes, because there is an arrow of time. There is irreversible processes. So the people said, how is it possible that stars are still burning if the universe if there is an infinite amount of time in the past? All stars should be should have ceased to exist. So they said, because of thermodynamics, there is a beginning. You see, if you see in a fireplace logs burning, you will conclude that somebody came a few hours ago putting fire in all this, because if this fire would be there for an eternal time, the logs should be ashes for an eternal time also. So the fact that something is burning now implies that there is a beginning. So it's not only the Big Bang, it's thermodynamics, Big Bang, but also rational approaches, because if you 6 centuries after Jesus, a guy called Philoponus, he makes commentaries of Aristotle, and he said it's not possible that there is an infinite amount of time in the past, because if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you never cease, you will go through what we call a potential infinite in the future, but it will never be an actual infinite. You will never be able to say, that's done, I reached infinity. And because you will never reach infinity coming from now, you will never reach infinity in the past, you cannot come from infinity and reach now, for the same reasons that you cannot go through infinity. So this guy made a very strong statement. He said, it's impossible that there is an infinity in the past, because it should be actual infinity. In the future, yes, you can have potential infinity, but not actual infinity. So he said there is a beginning. And so you have rationality, but you have also mathematics that said infinity does not exist in real physics, cosmology. You have the Borde-Good-Willemkin theorem that said that if the Big Bang is not the only the singularity, there is other Big Bang before the Big Bang. You have not an infinite number of Big Bang. You have a beginning. So now, as I told you in the beginning, it's very simple. A child can understand this. You see, there is a beginning, and because there is a beginning, there is something outside the universe that creates all this. And this force, this entity, this God who creates the universe is also a perfect engineer, because he selects every parameter exactly like you need in order that we can be there, and that you can have complex life on Earth. You know that something very important, when Georges Lemaitre, who was a Catholic priest in the West, was the first to give this idea that at the beginning there is an atom, the universe began with a very small entity. Many people disagree because of philosophical reasons, because they said, "Oh, you have the theory just to fit with the Genesis, with the Bible vision of the world." And he said, "No, I am a physicist." But one of his most important opponent was Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle was the one who coined the term Big Bang in order to mock the concept. He was in the BBC. And he said, you cannot imagine that all this begin with a Big Bang. And in fact, the term remains because it was very, very shocking. Mm-hmm. So this guy was an atheist, and he said that he imagined something else, what we call the steady state theory, in order to compete with the theory of the Big Bang. And because he said clearly that he did this because he does not believe in Bible, and he was an atheist. But this guy convert in the 1950s because he studied what we call the triple alpha reaction, how carbon could be produced in the heart of stars with the combination of 3 atoms of helium together with beryllium 8, and after another carbon. And you have the necessity of a very special excited state of carbon with a very special value in order that this reaction could work. And at the time of Fred Hoyle, nobody knows that there is such an excited level of carbon. And he contacted a very well-known laboratory called Caltech and said, we have the carbon with no the carbon and excited carbon, but isn't it something between at the very special 7.65 mega electron volt value? Because if this value does not exist, it's impossible to produce carbon in the stars. And the people said, no, we don't know this value. But they looked at this, and at the end they find that it exists such a value of the excited carbon. And you know, if you change of 1% the mass of the quarks, the values change, and you cannot have carbon in the stars. So at the end, Fred Hoyle convert, and he became a believer, and he said, there is a super intellect behind all the laws of quantum mechanics. So this guy, who was a very convinced atheist, because of science, convert and become a believer.
So, cards on the table with the so with the Big Bang, I see it as very simple. If we can show that the universe had a beginning, then it's a contingent being. If it's a contingent being, then it relies ultimately on a necessary being. From this, we can unpack the divine attributes. Slam dunk. And like Thomas Aquinas basically thinks that if we can show that the universe began, end of story. Like, this is easy. With the fine-tuning argument, that's a little bit different. It shows that the unlikelihood of it being this way and not another way points towards it having been directed towards a specific end. Then we look at, well, what can direct something towards an end in this way by imbuing it with such natures and whatnot. The fine-tuning argument is one that intuitively I think everybody grasps, like, the power of it. We just all know it's incredibly unlikely and weird and probably not predicted by the base naturalistic hypothesis that we would have living, thinking beings like ourselves reflecting back on the origin of the universe from which we came. This seems a little weird. My issue has always been exactly how we connect the dots in the most rigorous way. So if you want to dig into that a little bit, we talk about things like probability, like what if this number was 1% off or 2% off? The issue is when we look at these things, we don't have prior observations of alternatives. If I was to flip a quarter and say, it's a 50-50 chance, then I could find, a European, I could find a euro and flip that and say it's probably going to be 50-50. I can use something that I know about probabilistic observations to make conclusions in other cases. But with the universe, we seem to have an N of 1. We have one case that we can even possibly conceive of a universe coming into being. And we already know that some more complex and higher order effects, for instance, things in biology, not all, but at least many seem to be reducible to rules in chemistry. And many, maybe all, who's to say, of those could be reducible to physics. And then some of the things we know in physics, we find root theories which explain more than one data point. So the question is, are we looking at the right point to figure out the probability? And how do we come up with these probabilities when we only have one observation? That's kind of my key issue with I mean, intuitively, it just seems right, but spell out the details for us.
Okay. In fact, I will just give you an example. If you try to, if you organize a lottery between all the inhabitants of the planet, 8 billion people, you will have a winner. Somebody will win. So if you interview him, he said, I had a lot of chance. But if you organize the same lottery next week, and it's the same guy who win, and if you organize another time for the third time lottery, and it's always the same, the police will come and say, it's not chance. We need another explanation. So we have in our world something like 30 parameters that are very, very fine-tuned, sometimes with much more accuracy than one part in 1 billion, in 8 billion. So all the scientists have a problem with the fine-tuning. There is only two ways to solve this problem. The first way is to say there is an intelligence behind this who adjust and calibrate every parameter. It's the believer's point of view, but it's also Einstein's point of view. The first one, Einstein, said that he said that all people who are invested in science will realize that an intelligence much more important than the one of the people of man is behind the laws of the universe. He said this in 1936 in a letter in Princeton to a little girl who asked him, do scientists pray? He said there is an intelligence behind the universe because, and it was before we discovered that there is so many fine-tunings in the universe, but it's the vision of the world of the believers. If you say there is no God, you need to imagine that all these parameters come by chance from a gigantic lottery, because what we call the multiverse. The multiverse, imagine that there is a natural process, there is a machine creating universes, not only one or two, but billions and billions of universes, and we are the only one in which there is life, complex life, because all the others are sterile. In fact, this solution of the multiverse does not work. And Stephen Hawking claimed this before he died. He said the multiverse theory is dead. Why did he say this? Because there is 4 problems. The first one is that it's 100% speculative. We cannot test it. We cannot falsify it. It's outside science. It's science fiction. But it's not very important. It could exist. The second one is that the multiverse does not explain the beauty of the universe, because in our universe, there is a lot of proportions, golden ratio, colors that are very, there is harmony. And you can imagine by chance something that works and which is absolutely ugly, because beauty is rare. If you want to be convinced that beauty is rare, you can try to paint something on. You will see that most of the time what you are doing is ugly. In order to make something beautiful, you need to be very careful, and it's not easy. So most of the time things are ugly and the universe is beautiful. It's a very strong argument. Third, in order to fit with the improbability that we have in our universe, you need to imagine something like 1 in 10 to the power of 500, for example, in physics, and much more in biology. But for example, the string theory, imagine that there is 1 to the power of 500 different types of universes. So an incredible number. If you want to understand what it means to make a solution of the fine-tuning problem with this atheist point of view, you have to understand what is this number of 1 to the power of 10 to the power of 500. For example, if I ask you to count to 1 billion, pronouncing one figure every second, night and days, you will need more than 30 years. If you want to count to 1 billion, you will need 2 billion times the age of the universe. You imagine what is 2 billion times the age of the universe? And with this, you are only at 10 to the power of 27. So 10 to the power of 27 is an incredible number. So 10 to the power of 500 is, you cannot imagine, it's absolutely crazy. So you have to believe, for example, the number of particles, of elementary particles in our universe, in all the observable universe, is something like 10 to the power of 80. So 10 to the power of 500 types of universes, it's totally crazy. So if you are an atheist, you need to believe such a crazy number of sterile universes. But it's not the most important argument. The most important argument is that if you have to select all the parameters of the universe in a very tiny range between 0 and infinity, you will never find, because you divide a very tiny range on infinity, you have 0 probability to have the good number. So you need, if you want to find the gravity force at 6.67 10 to the power of minus 11 for the gravity force, you need to target between, if you want to have 6, you need to target between 5 and 10, or 2 and 20. But if you target between 20 and 30, you will never find 6. So the machine, the natural process that created universes, should be fine-tuned in order to select the good tiny ranges. And Stephen Hawking said, okay, the process should be fine-tuned, but by whom? So in order to explain the fine-tuning, you need another fine-tuning. So it does not work. That's the reason why Stephen Hawking... That's the reason why Stephen Hawking and many people said that this hypothesis is dead.
Mm-hmm.
At the end, you have a very new question, 2 very important new questions: the beginning and the fine-tuning. All this kind of problems does not exist 70 years ago. But today, science need to answer, because science is based on the principle of causality. When you discover something, you try to find the cause. Today we discover the beginning and we discover the fine tuning. We need to find the cause of these two problems, and you
Yeah.
have no answer in an atheist point of view.
So the multiverse, my biggest problem is whatever is creating this abundance of universes, seemingly out of nothing, seems vastly more in need of an explanation than a single universe. So we would simply have pushed the problem back to say, well, what on earth causes it to be this and not that, to be tuned in order to do this universe generating effect? And what possible falsification would we have for this, as you mentioned earlier? As far as the parameters, though, to give an example, if you're building a rock wall and you have 10,000 rocks to put into your rock wall, and you have so many different spaces, they could go anywhere in your rock wall. The permutations of that are unbelievable. If you do the math on that, you'll find out there's more ways to build that rock wall than there are atoms in the universe, if you do that math. However, you also find that there's a logical order of dependency which constrains the probability space, such that this is a solvable problem. We don't need somebody building a rock wall computing, 10 to the 500 different ways to build it and then zeroing in on one way that makes it 2 foot high and roughly square. Instead, we find that you put the large rocks in first, and this constrains your probability space such that the next stone has a more clear space. So I bring this analogy up to say, when we look at the outcome of our universe, it's easy to backtrack and say the probability is, unbelievably, unimaginably difficult. But if we go back to the beginning of it, just like we have somebody building a rock wall saying, well, no, there's a logical order of dependency such that I line up these large ones and then the rest fit naturally afterwards. Who's to say that there aren't some higher order laws, which are the proverbial large rocks, that once you have the gravitational force of X, well, this logically constrains from an infinite possibility of the speed of light down to, well, maybe one or maybe two options, or who knows, at which point from that point on to what we observe in the universe, maybe there's vastly fewer options than we're imagining. But what would you say to something like that?
Excuse me, but I did not catch exactly the question. Can you repeat?
Sure. So when we look at today and we see all the different, you mentioned 30 parameters, and we say that they could be many different things, that seems entirely correct. However, if we go back to the origin of the universe, could we find a order of dependence such that if parameter 1 was set to, let's say, X, then that would dictate that further parameters would fall in a logical sequence, kind of like the analogy of if you're building this massively complicated stone wall, if you first place a series of large rocks, the probability space is massively constrained for the further rocks such that they can slot logically in. And you're not dealing with all the permutations of the rock wall and deciding on one. You've constrained it massively by first having a order of dependency. If this rock, then the next one logically follows. So could it be
Yes,
that at the origin of the
what you are
universe,
saying.
one variable was set?
Some people try to imagine what we call the theory of everything, which means
Mm-hmm.
that there is a lot, a meta law in the universe that we don't know for the moment, that implies that all the parameters have this special value and not another one. We call this the
Mm-hmm.
theory of everything. But in the same moment, Stephen Hawking said this theory is dead also, because how can you imagine that there is meta law and constraints that makes that the value of gravity or the value of the speed of light, of the value of the mass of the proton, of the electron charge, all this should be this and not something very small and different, something different. It's not possible to logically, you cannot say that. We said that in philosophy that it's contingent. It's a value, it's like this, but it could be another value. And if gravity had another value, we will not be there to talk about this, because we need a special set of parameters, very special, and we can modelize this in computers today. We can modelize, if you change a little the parameters, what happened in the beginning of the. For example, I have this one of the most important fine tuning, what perhaps the greatest one is the one of what we call the cosmological constant. You see, in our book, we said that there is a value of this cosmological constant, which is 120 order of magnitude less than what we can imagine with our models. This value is not zero, but it's very, very small. And it's in Einstein equations for the speed and the acceleration of the universe. This number is 0 with 120 0 and 1, 3, and 8. If in spite of having 120 0, you have 119 0, we are not there to talk about this. The value of this constant, this cosmological constant, is absolutely incredible, and nobody knows, nobody understands, nobody can explain why this is this value and not another one. Because if you have this value should be a little more, the speed of the universe will accelerate at the beginning, and you have no galaxies, no stars, no life. So you see, when you have such incredible settings, such incredible improbabilities, you need to ask a question. If you play dice and you have a double six every time in a row, 100 times in a row, you need to say there is a problem. We need an explanation. It's not chance. So it's exactly the situation in which we are today. There is so many incredible coincidences, and there is no explanation, no meta law that make constraint in order that to have this value, and it's not rational. It's not rational to think about this.
So let me ask you another question. I often hear some version of, and you can tell me, what you think about this, or if you hold both of these, some version of, morality doesn't seem like it would arise out of evolution, or life itself does not seem like it would arise out of these random chemical processes, which we assume were present in early Earth. So there's kind of claim one that you often hear, that features of the universe that we are quite sure of, like we arise, like we're here, and we have this moral instincts which presumably track reality. Many argue that those don't seem like they could have come from the processes that we saw through science in early Earth, let's say. However,
so
oftentimes you also hear the claim that the universe was tuned for life by God in a certain way, such that the universe would bring about us and whatnot. However, I kind of see a bit of a tension here. It seems to be making two contradictory claims. One, that when we look at the universe, it's pointing towards life. And the other one is, when we investigate the origin of life, everything is pointing away. Or the universe is made by God such that it arrives at an end. This end includes living a moral life. And yet we say, but hang on, morality does not seem like it would have arisen from the universe. So I see these kind of in tension. Maybe you can resolve that tension for me. It seems like
Okay.
if God would create the universe, we would look back and go, that's how life is created because he created it to create life. This is how morality is brought about because he set up the universe to bring about morality. But it seems like with morality and the origin of life, there's puzzles which I wouldn't necessarily predict given the fine-tuning hypothesis by a God. So what do you think of that?
We have two chapters about this, but very different chapters. We have one chapter about morality because we try to ask the people, can you imagine that like atheists need to conclude that there is no good or evil? It's only conventional democratic convention, but there is no real good and evil. And in fact, you will see it in chapter number 22, we conclude that it's impossible for people to live in a world when they believe that there is no good and evil. Nobody lives like this, but it's the conclusion of the atheist vision of the world, because if there is nothing more than the material universe, there is absolutely no way to explain we are only clusters of cells bring there by the force of physics and chemistry, and there is a particular configuration of atoms that makes men and women, but tomorrow it will be another configuration, and no one has more value. But this vision is impossible to it's impossible to live with this vision. Nobody live concretely in practice with the atheist vision of the world. This is the moral vision. The second question is about the beginning of life, because in the past we believed in what we call spontaneous generation. We think that if you take matter, inert matter, and you do a little things, you will have life emerging very simply. But all this changed when we discovered the complexity of life. The complexity of life is that every life on Earth, from bacteria to human beings, and every plants and every animals is composed with cells, and every cell is composed with DNA, proteins, enzymes, ribosome, membrane. Okay, so life began on Earth 3.8 billion years ago with the first cell, but at this time, before life, the laws of the universe create an incredible technology, the DNA. And just to imagine, the density of information in DNA is 44 billion times more dense than what we are doing in our century with the most technological chips. So scholars and all the philosophers understood that DNA is a marvel of technology that came from the laws of the universe, perfect 3.8 billions of times before, and years before, and it codes everything. How can you imagine this? It's absolutely improbable. You cannot imagine this without a fine-tuning of the laws of the biology, much more incredible than laws of physics. So that's why today, when even atheists, for example, Francis Crick, we discovered the DNA, he was a total atheist, and he said the beginning of life is a miracle. You know, people like him, atheist top scientists, they are speaking of miracles, they are speaking of God, they are speaking of astonishing coincidences, because what we discover leads to death. The life is really a miracle. I can tell you that the complexity of life in one single cell is something incredible. Every second you have between 1 million and 1 billion different coordinated action in the metabolism. Nobody can explain such a complexity without an intelligence behind.
Wow. Well, the book is God, the Science, the Evidence. Guys, go grab yourself a copy. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, it's a bit of a page turner, I will say. I was flipping through different sections I found interesting, and really, the part that struck me most was I didn't know the historical um, evolution of this idea that when we see modern science and we take for granted that, oh yes, there's a big bang, we understand what's going on with like the laws of entropy, we all are at least vaguely familiar with the concept of heat death.
Yes,
These were things
Jake.
which were viewed as um,
Yes.
theistically loaded concepts that people were persecuted for at many times and places, which have been co-opted by secular groups. This was slam dunk theistic evidence at the time that it was brought out. Evidence for the beginning of the universe, evidence for the improbability of all of these, fine-tuned variables. And I think we've just kind of ceded the territory and said, no, 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 that's all science and it's against us. And you've definitely inverted that by showing, no, this was always viewed, even by hostile sources, as something which is in favor of the theistic hypothesis.
Yes, what we can say that for me, what is very surprising is the paradox of the fact that what science and rationality says and what people have in mind are very different.
Mm-hmm.
People have in mind that science leads out of God, but the reality is the opposite. In fact, so the public remains largely unaware of the great reversal in science. That's the key point. Now, for centuries, belief in God was relegated to the realm of superstition. Yet, reason has come full circle. Now, science is God's ally. And nobody knows this really in the public. That's the reason of this book. This book, as you said, is it seems difficult to. It seems about modern science and very thick, but in fact, it has been written on for you. In every chapter is independent. You can read this in one evening, and you can. There is notes, but at the footnotes, but all the text is very simple so that the public can understand. And that's the reason of the success of the book. At this time, we sold more than 450,000 books in Europe and now in the US and Mexico. So it's a very large success. And the reason of the success is that the people understand what we are saying. We did a job of journalists. We try to make the impressive discoveries of science accessible to the people, and because in fact it is simple. So we think that it's very important to spread the world and to correct the false vision of the world that the people have, that science is against God. It's absolutely crazy.
I love it. I am curious. You've done a number of interviews in the US and in Europe. You've presumably talked to a number of people who have read this book in Europe and some in the US. Culturally, what have you found the differences with? Because, I mean, in the US, a lot of the arguments for God amongst Catholics are the five ways of Aquinas, are philosophical arguments. Many of our Protestant friends are more into the moral and fine tuning arguments. There's plenty of crossover. What have you seen just culturally with the reception of your book
No,
on
we are
Europe versus the US?
in fact, we agree with the philosophical evidence for God or the morality and things like this. But what is very impressive is that everything converge, because the question of is there a God or not, which is the question of our book, is a binary question. The answer is yes or no, and the only thing that makes that we cannot decide is our lack of knowledge. But the knowledge is growing very fast today in every field of knowledge, And what is very surprising, what strikes me a lot, is that everything converge now: philosophy, morality, science, the great enigmas, the miracles. I'm a Christian, so I have also. We are working in France on a new project with 1,000 reasons to believe in Jesus. You see, this is the book, this is the magazine. So 1,000 reasons to believe in Jesus is there is reasons to believe in Jesus. Of course, Jesus is God. God exists. There is reasons through prophecies, through miracles, not one miracles, uh, thousands of miracles, thousands of saints, thousands of apparitions, thousands of people saying that they have a personal relationship with Jesus. So how can you explain all this? For me, it's impossible to explain all this without God. And it's something that we have in this book. We are speaking in this book about Fatima, about the Jewish people, about Jesus, about the Bible. And when you look at different, when you are Sherlock Holmes or you are making an investigation, what at the end is very convincing is that when every evidence converge in the same direction. And that's the case. That's the case of this book.
Mm-hmm. I think of, we've done some Bayesian analyses on different questions on this podcast. And when you actually put some numbers to it and show, okay, I'm not going to say, I'm not convinced, or, I am convinced, but you put a number to it and you start doing that math and you show how these different parts of these different evidences multiply by one another, you can very quickly see the strength of converging evidence. That when we have independent lines of reasoning, one from miracle claims,
Exactly.
you don't have to,
Yes.
as an atheist or agnostic, say, you 100% convinced me. We just have to say, with this phenomenon like Fatima or the persistence of the Jewish people or other things that you bring up in the book, how consistent is this with the God hypothesis? How consistent is this with the atheistic hypothesis? And then just see which one matches. And I think that when you add in the fine tuning, how predictive would it be given a intelligent, all powerful creator that we would see phenomenon like intelligent beings which exist and can reflect back on their creation? Well, highly predicted with the theistic hypothesis. How predicted is that with a principle of indifference in naturalism? Well, it's really not predicted at all. And then when you compare those two and you weigh it against the evidence we observe, that's a strong case.
We call it inference to the best explanation. You look at the world and you have to infer the best explanation. And of course, for us, the conclusion of our book, because I have to leave now, the conclusion of our book is very clear. As authors, we are saying that materialism is now an irrational belief. It's impossible to be rational and to continue to be a materialist. That's our conclusion. We will see. This book is an investigation about with only one angle, about one very limited question: is there a God or not? With a limited angle, rationality, and also we are examining 12 different fields of knowledge, and we are saying to the people, you are the jury, you will decide what you want, but look at this and make your decision freely.
Well, thank you for what you did. And
thank you very much,
Jake. On the
Jake.
Podcast. It was a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Jake. Bye-bye.